Hey everybody, this is Dan for StocksPoker.com, and in this video I'm going to have the next part in my O8Basics series, and this one's going to be about play on the flop, and it's going to be mostly focused on continuation betting, when to do it and when not to do it, and then a few other things as well. So the first thing I want to talk about before I get too far into this is a common thing that comes up in PLO8, and this applies a little more to beginners. Some of you guys have been playing for a while kind of already know this probably, but it's for completeness in the series I want to cover it, and that's playing for half on the flop, which, as most people have heard, is kind of a bad idea, and I ran a few simulations just to kind of try to express why that is so. So in the first hand, you get ace, deuce, nine, queen, and you flop the nut low with basically not a lot of high potential, and so you can see versus various hands, you're usually at best kind of 50-50, and a lot of times you can be behind even though you've got the nut low. And then in the second example, you've got the queen jack 10-9 wrap, which is not very good in PLO8. In PLO it's a monster, but PLO8 loses quite a bit of value. And so you can see here we flop the nut straight with redraws to higher straights. You're still going to be actually a little bit behind a lot of hands, so you can't just necessarily go berserk and try to get all your money in a situation where you're likely just going to be getting half the pot. So just a word to be careful in a lot of those situations. So now I want to get into kind of the main discussion, which is, for this video, which is continuation betting. So basically, when should you do it? And to make a long story short, there are sort of two essential times, not essential times, but two main times where you'll do it, and that's with a really strong hand where you're doing it for value, and then with a really weak hand when you're doing it as a bluff. And generally, you're not going to do it as much with your sort of mediocre hands, and there are a couple reasons for that. Is, well, when you've got the strong hand, you want to bet because you're doing that for value. And then sometimes when you've got a very weak hand, you're just doing it as a bluff. There's not much to give up. You don't like to do it as much with your medium strength hands because the problem there is you can't handle it generally if you get raised or check raised. So if you've got a medium strength hand, you generally have a fair bit of equity in the pot, and you don't want to get raised out, because if you get raised out, then you lose that equity you have, and you don't get a chance to sort of realize that equity later in the hand. So medium strength hands, a little bit more of a tendency to check behind or check into people, and then you want to bet the like I said, the stronger and weaker hands. So other good times in general to do it. The other thing too is not just the strength of your hand, but also the board texture, which the board texture may be more important sometimes than the actual strength of your hand. And so some typical good board textures to do this on are when there's only one low card on the board, because it just cuts down on the number of draws people have. Generally, people like to play hands with a lot of wheel cards and a lot of low cards, and so if there's no low draw on the board, you can get people to give up a lot more. And the other time, like in, I think probably most any poker game, is when the board pairs, just because there are fewer combinations of hands your opponents can have that hit that board, and a lot of players tend to get pretty scared when the board pairs because they're worried you have trips or they're worried you're boated up. So more often than other board textures, you can take it down when the board is paired. And then the other kind of Captain Obvious thing is you want to do it when there are fewer players. So generally, you're c-betting a lot more when you're speed-betting a lot when your head's up, and somewhat when you're three-handed. When you start getting into big multi-way pots, then you're not c-betting. When you get into multi-way pots, you still may c-bet a lot, but in a multi-way pot, you're going to be c-betting for value, and basically never as a bluff, because if you got multiple players and everybody's got four cards, and people in this game tend to call too much anyways, you are going to get called. So your c-betting for bluffs will happen a lot more, obviously, in heads-up pots, and then your big multi-way pots, you're just betting to try to extract value. And another thing people ask is how often do you see bet percentage wise, and obviously it's going to depend on the table you're at and the opponents that you're facing. You're going to want to look at their stats, and that's going to have a big determination on whether or not you see bet. But I went in my database and I pulled up the players that I had the most hands on and looked at some of the winning players, and a lot of them are like in that kind of 50 to 70% range overall. There's no strict guideline on this. A lot of this is personal style and depends on the games that you're playing in. So there's not a solution for the percentage of hands that you should be c-betting, but that's kind of a typical range. I think if you're c-betting less than 50%, you're probably not c-betting enough. And if you're c-betting every hand, that's not going to be the best, because you're going to get yourself in some sticky spots and you're going to start building pots in places where you don't want to be building pots. I did have one player in my database, really winning player, that I had a lot of hands on, that c-bets like 85% of his hands. And so you can be successful c-betting some really high percentages, but I think that guy was a little bit of an outlier there. And he was someone that plays very, very well, and he can kind of get away with c-betting the flop maybe more than what's optimal, because he's going to play really well on the turn and on the river. So speaking of the turn, the other thing you want to think about when you're c-betting is what kind of cards do you want to see on the turn. If you've got somewhat of a made hand, like say, I don't know, like a two-pair hand, or two-pair with some other draws to go with it, but not nutty draws and not maybe top two, and you're in one of those situations where you've got kind of a medium strength hand, not a monster, but you don't have air, you want to think about what comes on the turn. And like for that situation I just described, there aren't really a whole lot of good turn cards that you want to see. So if you are thinking ahead to the turn and most of the cards are going to be bad for you, then c-bet when you think you can take it down on the flop and not as much for value, because when you get to the turn, then your hand a lot of times is going to be ruined if you get called. And then the other thing c-betting on the flop does for you is it sets you up to barrel on the turn. And I think I'm going to talk more about this in future videos. This is more about just play on the flop. But amongst players in PLO8 who are pretty decent and aren't making this kind of stupid beginner mistakes, and they sort of know what they're doing, amongst those kinds of players, I think one of the biggest flaws they have in their game is they don't barrel the turn enough. Barreling the turn is really, I think, essential to winning post-flop, and I'll have a whole video on when to do that and when to not do that. But you can't really barrel the turn unless you bet the flop. When you bet the flop and bet the turn, that's a whole lot stronger than checking behind on the flop and then betting the turn, because what happens is if you check the flop and then bet the turn, obviously people just aren't going to give you as much credit normally as if you bet both those streets. So it kind of gives you more leeway to take people off hands and take pots down in situations where maybe you're going to chop on the turn, and I think you gain a lot of EV by being able to do that. So bet sizing, when we're sizing our bets, don't size your bets around the strength of your hand. Generally you're going to want to size it around board texture. So the wetter the flop, the more you're going to bet, and the drier the flop, you can bet a little bit less. So if there's flush draws and straight draws and low draws, most of the time you're going to be betting the full size of the pot. Whereas if you have a example of a dry flop, might be a king 10 4, something like that, that offsuit that not many people are going to hit, then a lot of times you can bet less, maybe 3/4 pot or sometimes half pot. Most of the time, though, when you are betting on the flop, a lot of times I'm betting full pot, especially when it's heads up in a single raised pot. Sometimes I'll bet less than that, and generally that's if the pot was 3-bet pre-flop, or you've got multiple players in, like maybe you got 3 players and the pot's getting to be a little bit of a decent size. Then you can You don't necessarily have to bet the full size of the pot. You can accomplish the same thing with maybe like a 3/4 size bet. But in general, we don't want to be betting less than half the pot because there's just not much of a point to that. I don't see a lot of scenarios where you would want to bet less than half the pot because for one thing, you're not going to get anyone to fold. And so there's no point in betting less than half the pot if you're expecting someone to fold because they're just not. And then if you're betting for value, there's not really a whole lot of point in that because, as we've talked about before, hand values run pretty close, and it's pretty rare in the flop to just completely have somebody stone dead. Usually they've got a fair amount of equity in the pot, even if you've got a big hand. So if you're making little tiny bets, all you're really doing is giving them a chance to catch up, and you're not extracting maximum value. And then the other thing you want to kind of keep in mind are stack sizes. So if the stack sizes are sort of short, well, there's a couple things. One is if the stack sizes are kind of short, then you may want to bet a little less so that you can leave yourself a full pot size bet on the turn to maximize your fold equity on the turn. And then that's one reason why you might bet less. And then the other thing you want to keep in mind is if the stack sizes are short and you bet full pot and the other guy shoves on you, you might end up pot committed in a situation where you don't want to be pot committed. And so in that scenario, you may actually just want to check instead of making that C bet and getting committed in a spot where you don't want to do that. And then the other thing too is when you have deep stacks, be very careful when you're out of position, and you don't necessarily want to bloat a pot if you're going to be out of position and deep stacked because that can be very, very tricky. All right. So another thing I want to talk about too, this is kind of a common situation that gets beginners in a lot of trouble and other players as well, is top set and PL08 is not the nuts. Now, I'm not showing this to say you're never looking to fold top set. I mean, there may be some rare situations where you need to do it, but the point I'm just trying to make here is that when you do have top set, although it's really a strong hand, it's not the stone nuts, and you can get yourself in trouble if you just pour tons and tons of money in on the flop because, like, you look at this situation, there are a lot of turn cards that are going to come that can be bad for our hand. You know, any low card, any spade is going to really mess us up on the turn. So if you make the pot huge on the flop, you can find yourself in a lot of tough turn spots. So in general, not folding, looking to put some money in, but want to be careful about how we do it, and just keep in mind that when you flop top set, it's not a license just to go bananas and jam every street necessarily. So the other thing I want to mention too, and I've talked about this before, is backdoor outs. So because these hand equities are just running so extremely close, when you have backdoor outs on the flop, that can really make a big difference on how playable a hand is. So I said your backdoor flushes at about 2% equity, and backdoor straights, you know, vary depending on the exact situation. But when a lot of things are running 50-50, getting that 2 or 4% extra equity is a pretty big deal over the long run. When to check raise, basically I don't check raise a whole lot. I'm not a huge fan of it. I certainly do it. I would never say never check raise because that would be kind of ridiculous. But generally, when you're checked, the kind of common situations that come up when you want to check raise are when you've got a very aggressive opponent behind you, and it's somebody that's going to bet out a lot of times when maybe, and you can basically get more money in the pot than you would if you just bet out and the guy called, or you bet out and the guy folded. So the problem though in PL08 is there aren't a ton of super aggressive players that you're going to be able to do this against. As time goes by, I'm noticing more and more, and so I think in the future I'll probably be check raising a lot more than I have in the past. I mean, at one point I almost never check raised because there just wasn't a huge point to it. You never got the opportunity. If you check, somebody would like check behind almost every time. But that's changing, but you just want to remember that don't do this unless you have a good reason for it. Unless you have some good reason to believe that you're ahead and the guy behind you is going to bet out, maybe on a bluff or just maybe betting pretty thin. And so the other thing you need to keep in mind are these stack sizes. By definition, if you're check raising somebody, you're generally going to be out of position against them. So when you do check raise and get called, you're bloating a big pot and you're out of position. So if you're deep, you want to be really careful doing this because you can leave yourself in some really awkward spots on the turn and the river. Now, if the stacks are shorter and you can get pot committed, that may be good if you have a strong hand. So let me back up a little bit. So let's say if you've got a hand where you want to get pot committed, then it's better to do this with shorter stacks because you may be able to get pot committed there after your check raise on the flop. But if you're doing this, if you're check raising as a bluff, which I don't recommend doing very often because people call you so much, but if you are doing that, then you actually want to do that with generally deeper stacks because you don't want to have short stacks and pot commit yourself. Whereas if the stacks are deeper, it doesn't really matter because if you're doing it as a bluff and you check raise and the guy shoves on you, well, it doesn't matter because now you're just going to be folding. So just kind of think about that and plan ahead before you check raise. Don't just flop a big hand and then you check raise and you get called and the stacks are deep and then a scary turn card comes and then you don't know what to do. Implied odds, this is another kind of basic poker concept that I think most people kind of understand, is basically if the stack sizes are deeper, you can play some more speculative hands because you've got the odds to get the rest of their stack, even if there's not that much money in the pot right now. But the thing you really need to just keep in mind with this is the players that you're up against. There are a lot of players in PL08 that are just nut peddlers. They're just mega rocks, and they will not put money in unless they have the nuts. So just watch your players' stats, and if you're up against one of those players, there are some extreme examples of players where you just don't have implied odds because they're not going to put money in without the nuts at all. And so against those players, you could be 10,000 big blinds deep, and it doesn't matter because unless they make the nuts on you, they're not going to go bananas. But other players will. There are a lot of other players in PL08 that are just monkeys and are like, hey, I have a pair, I'm going to call, and they will just call you down with anything. And against those players, you have huge implied odds. Sometimes you can almost just count on getting their whole stack if you hit your hand. So watch the players and just recognize that against some players, you almost never have implied odds, and against other players, you almost always have huge implied odds. I try to talk about that with just talking about the reverse implied odds, and basically just means be careful with your non-nut draws because this is Omaha, and a lot of times people have the nut draws drawn to your king high and queen high flushes. Can be very dangerous, as well as non-nut lows, and you don't want to draw to a hand and then be committed to the pot and end up getting value town because the other guy had the bigger hand or the bigger draw. So just be careful when you have your non-nut draws. This isn't to say don't play non-nut draws. I'll play non-nut draws a lot, but just be aware of the reverse implied odds situations that you have. And so just another note is, in general, you're not going to be doing a lot of trapping in PL08. There are a lot of reasons for this. One is because these equities run close. You're never really crushing people like you can sometimes in no limit hold'em. You can crush people on some spots, but it's a little bit more rare. So in general, when you have a strong hand, you're going to want to bet it for value because there's a good chance they're going to catch up to you. And a lot of these players are more passive than what they should be, and so you can't expect them to bet your hands for you. And so, I guess like Jerry Springer or something, I just wanted to have a final thought for this slideshow is when you're thinking about what to do post-flop, always look at the players and always look at the board texture and always be looking at the stack sizes and just realize that there's no formula for how to play. And the other thing too is that game conditions are always changing. I know in the past year I think that game conditions have changed a fair bit. I think players are getting better you're starting to see more aggressive players. You're starting to see a few less of just the super donks that call everything. So kind of don't put the blinders on and come up with a style that works and then just never change it over time, because you may get in trouble. Rather than have a set of rules that you follow for how to play, what you really want is a thought process, because if you have a good thought process, then your game's just going to kind of automatically adapt to conditions over time, and you're always going to keep your edge. So with that, I'm going to pull up some hands that I played, and I'm going to go through some examples of when to c-bet and when not to c-bet. Alright, so in this part of the video, I'm going to go through some hands that I played a few weeks ago, back around the holiday time, and I basically filtered it for hands where I raised pre-flop and then there was at least one caller. So these are all, I think, single raised pots, but this should give us some good examples of when we can c-bet, when we can't. So kings in the cutoff, we raise, and then here we got a flop which has one low card, which automatically makes it fairly decent for c-betting. You do have some flush and straight draws, so that kind of argues for a larger bet. And so what I like to do here most of the time probably is bet full pot, although in this case I actually didn't quite do that and we got called. So as I go through these hands too, I'm not going to play out the whole hands because I don't want to get wrapped around the axle on turn and river play. I just want to kind of talk about some of these board textures and some of the players and where it's good to c-bet and where it's not. The other thing to kind of point out about our opponent here, Ragnar Rock, is he's a pretty good player. He's playing 27-11. I've played with him a fair bit, and also just to kind of talk about some of these stats. So this is how often they c-bet. So he's c-betting 70% of the time, but he's folding to a c-bet 62% of the time. So he's playing pretty strong hands. He's a good player. He knows which hands are have a lot of equity on the flop and which ones don't. And so he's giving up quite a bit of the time. So that's another argument for c-betting into him. But like I said, I think betting the full 425 would have been better, given that it'll get him off some flush draws and some straight draws. Although usually he's going to be tending to show up with more low cards. I don't think he's going to show up with a lot of Queen Jack 8 wraps and things like that. This next one, another King's hand. So here's a good example of flopping top set where we got the nuts right now. And actually it's weird, we kind of got two sets, which is a little bit odd, but the second set doesn't help us too much other than giving us one more out to quad. So here's a situation where any low card or any flush card and a lot of other low cards will make straights possible. So we've got the nuts right now, but our hand is pretty vulnerable. And the other thing to notice is our opponents here are really, really fishy. You got a guy playing 77% of hands and 59% of hands, and they're also very passive. So, and their stacks are short. So this is one where we just want to bet out for value, and then if we get called, we're going to tend to stick it in on the turn almost no matter what. So we bet out full. And actually we get one caller because they're fishy, and then that card really sucks. Actually, let's just see what happened here because I don't remember. Yeah, we just jam it in, and I think he gets us. So that kind of sucked, but I think that was the best way to play it there. I mean, checking is horrific on that flop. So this one we've got ace deuce 3 with one suit, but we've got 3 of the suits, so that hurts us a little bit. And I raise this under the gun, which is a little speculative. Limping this is fine. The raise under the gun with that may have been a little over aggressive, but as it turns out, we get called by Tugger Nuts out of the small blind, which is pretty good. So we actually end up in position against this rock. So you can see this guy's 14-4. Not real aggressive, but strangely enough, not folding to a lot of continuation bets, which is kind of weird. So Jack 5-10, we got our one low card, flush card where we have no suits, but we've got some backdoor draws to lows and wheels, and so I checked behind here. This is one where I'm not sure what I was thinking at the time. I think this is one where you can definitely see bet out. If you check raises or something, you can just give up. But there are a lot of turn cards. You're going to get some lows and things where you might be able to continue. So, but checking behind there is okay. Just maybe considering that he doesn't like to fold to a whole lot of C bets. A lot of these hands too, when you get into post flop, kind of like the pre flop, there are a lot of different styles and a lot of different ways you can play these. The main thing is that you're adapting well to your opponents. So, okay, ace ace 3. And we get 2 callers. So here we've got nut low draw, over pair of aces, and we're blocking the nut flush. And the stacks are really short, and we've got 2 fishy players. So in this situation, this is another one where we're looking just to stick the money in, and what happens, happens. Another thing I want to mention too is having the nut flush blocker. It adds value to your hand, blocking the nut flush, because people will tend not to draw to non-nut flushes as much. But you want to be careful because it doesn't give you as much of an edge as you think, and you don't want to just go crazy bluffing. Like say on the turn the flush card comes in, you don't necessarily just want to fire blocking the nuts, because you will get called down a bunch. For one thing, the bad players, the fishy players, kind of like these guys, they'll call with non-nut flushes because they don't know any better. Better players may call because they've got low draws or other kinds of draws, or they may, if it's a really good player, they may realize that if they perceive you as a decent player, they may think that, well, you could be bluffing the nut flush blocker. So basically, there are some times where I will bluff the bare ace, but a lot of times it doesn't work. Those situations are fairly few and far between, so just a word of caution on getting too crazy with those kinds of hands. So, but anyways, it checks to us, and we fire pot, get a caller, and this is another one where, yeah, now we make the nut low, you're just going to jam the turn. Boom. I end up chopping, which happens a lot in this game. So, ace deuce 5, the suited ace. So, it's a pretty good hand, definitely one we're going to open from the cutoff. And so we're out of position against this fish. And so here we get a monotone board, and with a low. We've got the nut low, so we've got, probably a quarter of the pot pretty well locked up, assuming we don't get counterfeited or something silly. Monotone flops is one thing I forgot to talk about in the slide part of this, and I like to bet a lot of monotone flops because a lot of people, if they don't have the flush, they'll just give up right away. And if you look at the card combinations, most of the time they don't have the flush. And the other thing is, because it's a case of where they either have the flush or they don't have the flush, they'll give up relatively easier. So a lot of times you can take down pots on monotone boards with a relatively smaller bet when you don't have the flush. Of course, we bet full pot anyways because we do have the nut low, and this guy is really a fish. So, okay. Ace ace 4-10 into the big blind. And that's weird. Why does that say 75? Alright, never mind. Alright, so in general, I'm not a huge fan of raising out of the big blind, but in this case we got 2 really fishy players behind us, and we've got a really strong hand. It'd be nice if we had some suits, but we don't. So now we're in a spot where we've got this guy short stacked. We've got our overpair of aces and the second nut low draw, so that's plenty to just jam the pot and try to get it in. There we go. Right. So this one, I chose to raise out of the small blind. In general, I don't do a lot of raising out of the small blind. The times I do are usually when it's heads up, because here the suited ace deuce queen and then the 6, it's a pretty decent hand. It's not like this thing is a total monster, but it's pretty good, and I don't like to play a limp pot against a fish. I like them to try to make him define his hand at least a little bit, because the problem is if you just complete, he's going to check behind with anything, and then you have no idea where you stand after the flop. And we do have a pretty good hand anyways, and because he's such a fish, he's not going to use his position against us that well. And so here we flop 2 pair, and this is sort of a trouble situation on the flop in general. I think that's another spot where it's nothing now I think about it, I probably should have put in the slides, but you know, it's another area where a lot of beginning players kind of get themselves in trouble is when they flop 2 pair in PLO8, because 2 pair is, well, in Omaha in general is not that great, and now here we don't have a low draw, so there's a flush draw we don't have, a low draw we don't have, and we've got this 2 pair which is kind of good but not that great, so it's sort of an argument for keeping the pot small. I think I'm not looking to check fold this. I think that's kind of overly nitty. You can bet and try to take it down, but if you bet and he calls, there are not going to be a lot of turn cards that we really like too much. So we bet and he does call. So and then we get what is actually a fairly decent turn card there. Alright, so suited aces with 2 low cards. Strong, definitely opening that. Okay, we get 2 callers, so we've got the good player over here, and then this other player that we don't know too much about. So, so at this point, we've got a crappy backdoor low draw, and then our overpair of aces, and most of the time we're going to be ahead in this pot. So, and the other good, and actually I think having the flush draw out there is actually sort of good, because what a lot of players do when the board pairs and they flop trips is they will generally check, because they're worried, well, if I bet for value, nobody will have anything, they'll just fold, and if I check, then I'll disguise my hand. And so, and then if they don't have the queen, you know, they're worried about the queen, and so they tend to check. So what happens is when the board pairs, it like almost always checks to you most of the time. But what's good about having the flush card is somebody with a queen but no flush draw may be worried about the flush draw and bet to protect. And so, you know, if they do have a piece of this, they're a lot more inclined to bet out. So when it checks to us, there's a fairly good chance we're ahead, and we can usually bet and take this down. Betting full pot into a paired board is usually not the greatest, because it kind of looks, well, okay, if you do bet full pot into a paired board, it tends to look kind of bluffy, and so if you're just doing it with air, you'll tend to get called more. Doing it with aces is a little better, because you may get called down by kings or other flush draws or things like that. So, but in this case, probably, you know, maybe this is a good spot for like a 3/4 type pot bet. And I don't remember what I actually did here, so we'll see. I checked behind. Okay, I think that was a big mistake. I think I'm definitely ahead here, and I should be betting for value and to guard against really random flush draws getting there, like, you know, silly 7-8 high flush draws. And so I checked behind, and now the flush card came, and now I'm in kind of a crappy spot, because like I said too, when you check behind on the flop, nobody really gives you credit for a hand on the turn. And so this kind of stinks, because now if it gets checked around to me, and now if I bet, you know, you're going to get called by all sorts of hands, and I'm not going to know where I stand on the river. So that was a spot where I think I definitely should have c-bet there. All right. So Jack, Jack, 10, King. So I got a player here who plays a lot of hands. Actually, I don't know about this guy's win rate. I can't remember him, but players with like the 39 or 35 stats, I don't know. A lot of them seem to be kind of winning players, although he is sort of passive. So here we get a flop. There's some straight draws, a low draw, the ace. A lot of times when an ace hits the flop, you will get called a bunch, because a lot of times when people are calling, they have an ace in their hand, and people don't like to fold top pair for one bet, even though a lot of times, yeah, you probably should. So on this kind of flop, you're going to get called a bunch, and so this is a good one to check behind. We've got our pair of tens. So we got some two pair outs. We got our jacks. We've got a gutter ball to Broadway, and I think it's just a better one. I hope I checked behind, which I did. So this is one of those medium strength hands where you hate to bet because if he check raises, we have to fold, and a lot of times we're going to be ahead and we have some decent equity in the pot that we like to get to showdown with and kind of realize that equity. Or, maybe have a situation where a good card comes on the turn, like say like the board pairs on the turn or something. Like if an 8 comes on the turn, that's a great card to bet if he checks to us. That'll take it down a lot. But if we bet here and get check raised, then we're going to be in trouble. Although having said that, this guy's aggression factor 0.9 is pretty small, so if he does check raise, he's probably going to have the nuts. Alright. And by the way, these are some of my favorite kinds of hands where you have like an ace and a wheel card and then a couple of Broadway cards to go with it. These hands play really, really well heads up, and so generally you want to hammer people with it. So, alright, so here there's a low possible, and we've just got top pair, and that kind of stinks. There's a lot of texture here. There's straight draws that he could have. There's flush draws he could have. He could have a made low. Another thing is people don't like to fold decent made lows to one bet, so this is another one where we probably just want to check behind. We've got top pair, queen kicker. The problem here is, like I said, if we bet and he raises, we have to fold. If we bet and he calls, I don't know of too many turn cards that we can really barrel and be happy about it, so that's another good spot for checking behind. Definitely raising that on the button, so heads up against a fish, and so we're going to bet like crazy. And we totally whiffed this flop, so here's a nuts or air kind of flop. Checks to us as always. Notice how often, too, people are like checking to us. Like it's kind of odd. I mean, usually you have a few people donking out into you at some point, but apparently not so much in this session. So this is one where, I said c-bet kind of your nuts or air, and this is sort of an air hand. So I think this is a good hand to bet out. It's only got the one low card, so it should work a decent amount of the time. And if we bet full pot here, let's see, if we bet full pot, there's going to be 6 in. We're going to kind of commit ourselves. If we, well, we won't be committed, but it'll be kind of gross if we have to fold. So we just check behind. Because see if, so let me talk about that in a little more detail. So if we bet here, because there's a flush draw and there's some straight draws, you kind of want to bet full pot, because otherwise, because the pot's so small, there's 3 big blinds in the pot, so it's hard to bet 2 big blinds because then you're guaranteed a call. So you don't want to do that because we don't really have anything. So if you want to do that, you want to bet full pot. So if we bet full pot, that's $3. And so if he jams on us, he's going to call our 3 and then put in another 6. So there's going to be 10, 16. We're going to be calling we're going to be getting like 4 to 1. I may have messed that math up, but we're going to be getting, even with just our crazy backdoor low draw and some other random cards, we're going to have to call them down, and that kind of sucks. So this is one of those spots where you want to watch the stack sizes and not get yourself in odds. Don't just c-bet automatically just because the guy's a fish and you have position. You want to watch those stack sizes and keep yourself out of some bad situations. This is a good high card hand. And here's another one where, this guy is pretty fishy. We've only got 48 hands, but, he's playing 60% of them. And you've got the low draw, the flush draw, the straight draws. And we've got really no part of this at all. So this is air. And so if we bet and he calls, we can't continue. And given the texture of the board, he's going to call. He's going to call a lot. So this is one where we just check into him, which I think is the best play. All right, so here's a 2-pair hand, and as I mentioned before, a 2-pair can be a little bit tricky. So the good news is there are no flush draws available. There's a low draw, but we have the second nut low draw and top 2. There are no made straights possible, so we're almost always way ahead here. not many combinations of queens or eights for sets. You know, he could show up with a set of sixes or something like that. But even if he shows up with a set of sixes, we've got our second nut low draw and a couple outs to make a boat. So we're definitely going to want to bet here, and this is going to be a bet for value. Boom, and he calls. So pretty standard there. And I'll do one or two more of these and then probably wrap it up here pretty soon. So this is another one. I raised this out of the small blind, and the main reason I did that was just because we were heads up. It was just kind of a blind versus blind. In general, I rarely raise out of the small blind. But blind versus blind, I'll do it quite a bit, especially with a hand like this that's, you know, yeah, you got ace deuce 3. It's not a monster, but it's still fairly strong. He calls, and then here, backdoor nut low plus nut flush draw plus pair. That's the world. So we're going to be going to war on this hand, and he ends up folding anyways. But given all of my draws in different directions and the fact that I had a pair, I'm willing to put a lot of money in the pot with that hand. Although you also have to recognize, because he's a good player, if he does want to play a big pot, he's going to have something. He's not going to show up with just random air. I think we'll make this the last one, and then I'll probably wrap this up. So raise that one, another heads up pot. So here's one where you have the nut low draw, and then it's a monotone board. So this is one if he checks to us. Oh wait, I got it backwards. We were out of position. Wait a minute, I checked that one. That was bad. Okay, so this is one where top pair, nut low draw, and it's a monotone board. I think I definitely want to be betting into him on this one because he's going to give up a lot when he doesn't have a flush. And if he's calling with some other kind of low draw, you're still going to have a lot of value because we've got our nut low draw and we've got top pair, top kickers. So, you know, the argument for checking to this is we are out of position, and if he calls, you know, and then you make your nut low, it can be odd. If he wants to play a big pot, you could end up playing for half, but in general, I kind of like the flop c-bet there. So with that, I'm going to wrap up this video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you got any questions about it, please send me a PM or post in the forum and let me know what you think. Thanks. Alright, so this hand, aces on the button, we're definitely going to be raising. And so we flop top set, and so this is another one of those situations where we have the nuts, but it's a little scary because there's low draws we don't have and flush draws that we don't have. And because we have a queen, this actually kind of hurts us a little bit because it takes away some of our full house draws. So we're definitely going to want a full pot there and try to take it down right now because a lot of turn cards are going to mean that we're going to be chopping this or even getting hosed if a flush card comes. So there's a pretty strong hand, really strong hand, kings with ace deuce. So there's a lot of flops we're going to like, and this flop is not the greatest. So we repair twos, our low gets wrecked completely, and we just got this overpair. And we're going to be getting called a bunch here if we bet. So if we bet here, it's really just to try to take it down. And this is one where I kind of like checking behind to see if the board can pair in the turn maybe, or something like that, or we can catch a flush card. And so we actually check behind, which I think is the best play there overall. You can definitely argue to c-bet, but you know, again, we've got probably decent equity with our kings, and if we bet and he raises, we have to give it up. And you don't want to start building a big pot, because if say another low card comes on the, like say you bet here and he calls, and then on the turn a 6 comes and he bets like half pot. That's really kind of a crappy spot to be in. So I think checking behind here and keeping the pot small is a little better play. Okay, so here's another one that I raise out of the small blind, which I don't do a lot, but I've got aces with a king and a flush, albeit with 3 flush cards. And I have the 7 going, so I have a little bit of a low draw. And I'll do this a lot too when people limp in on the button. I hate it when people limp in on the button. And it's amazing how often when people do that and you raise out of the blinds, they'll fold quite a bit. There are a lot of players who will just limp a gigantic range from the button, and usually if they have a better hand, they're usually raising from the button. So even though I'm out of position, I like to attack that quite a bit. And this is a guy that's 33-2 and 1.4. He's not going to be super aggressive and use his button against us too much anyways. So here basically over pair of aces with the top pair of kings and only one low card, no flush draws. So really dry texture, which can argue for maybe less than a full pot size bet, and the odds are that he hasn't. Odds are we're ahead of this pretty often. We're blocking one. We got one of the kings, and for him to show up with 10-6 or 6-6 is possible, but not super likely. And he could have, he's probably got some backdoor low draws maybe or something like this. So this is one where betting full pot is fine. If you want to bet a little less, maybe betting like 350 or something is okay too. I don't remember exactly what I did here. I bet 3. That's probably a little small. 2/3 I think. Probably at least bet like 325 or 350 because this is kind of begging him to call. There we go, and he ends up folding anyways. So again, I think that was a good C bet, but a little bit on the small side. So this one, that's double suited with ace-5. That's a little bit speculative. That early in position to be raising, I think it's fine, but not raising is okay as well. So here's a a paired board, but with a low draw. The good thing is we've got the ace-5 low, so we have a reasonable kind of low draw, and this guy is pretty fishy. So I think this is begging for it's definitely begging for a bet, and because the texture is fairly dry, we don't necessarily have to bet full pot. So I think like a $3 bet or so is probably pretty good here. Bet 350, and that ends up working. Okay, so now we're like really short-handed, three-handed here against Blue Boy, who never raises, so you can pretty much bet he's not going to raise us. And he's fairly passive, so the ace-4 low draw plus top pair. There are lots of straight draws out there. This guy's fairly tight, so you're not really too worried. 9-10 here makes the nuts, but Blue Boy is fairly tight, and so he's not going to show up with many 9-10s in his range, because those are just kind of junky cards. And PLO8, and although this guy is not very aggressive, it doesn't mean that he totally doesn't understand how to value hands. He's just not very aggressive with them, so not really too worried about the 9-10. Odds are we're way ahead on this flop, but again, we don't want a low card to come and have him get there with ace-3 or ace-2, or have something else kind of silly happen, have him hit a random set. So I think we definitely want to be betting out here, and this pot is pretty small. It's only 375 anyway, so I think you just go ahead and bet full pot. So I think checking behind there was a mistake against him. The other thing too is this guy is fairly passive, so if he you kind of want to make him call or raise and sort of define his hand a little bit here. I think giving him a free pass with this was probably a mistake, although this is one of those where it is kind of a marginal type hand, top pair, top kicker, third nut, low draw, and so that's the argument for checking behind. But the guy is just never going to show up with 9-10, and I don't know if he's a good enough player not to realize that we're not going to show up with a lot of 9-10s either, so he may be afraid of the nuts out there. So anyways, I think I think that was a better spot to see bet. I probably should have done that instead of checking behind. So kings here, and this is really a crappy flop for our hand. So you've got, well, first of all, you got the ace, which sucks. You got the flush draw, the low draw that we don't have, and all we're doing is sitting here with these kings. And even if we hit a king to make a set, we're not really happy because one of those kings is going to be a spade, and even if we bang that other non-spade king, there is some chance this guy could show up with queen 10 to make Broadway on us, because he's such a fish. He's playing so many hands. He's not the kind of player where you can eliminate those 9s and 10s out of his range. He could certainly have them, and if he's got flush draws and low draws, he's going to have a lot of equity against us. So this is one where there's no turn card that we're happy with, and so our hand is really weak. We're at the air side of our range, and there's so much texture on this board that a fish like this is just going to call like every single time. So with that, I really hope I checked behind on this hand, which I didn't, and that was, I don't know what I was thinking here. That was really like a retarded c-bet. I don't think that was a good idea at all. Like I said, I played this a few weeks ago, and it was near the holidays, so who knows? I may have been drunk or what. I think that's the excuse I'm going to go with on that one. Okay, so I think I'm going to wrap it up here pretty soon. So high board, one low card, flush draw we don't have, and we got our pair plus gutter ball, and we check into that, which is fine. You can also argue for a bet, but there is the flush draw and the straight draw in there, and we're out of position versus in position, which is another thing to consider. Don't really want to go bloating a pot. The problem is if we stab here and he calls, there aren't a lot of turn cards where we can put more money in, really. So luckily he checks behind and kind of gives us a pass. We have a chance to maybe try to get to our backdoor low draw or make two pair, trip fives, or something like that. I think that was a good check behind. So here I do a min raise, which I haven't been doing too much in this session. Let's go back and look at that a little more. So a bunch of wheel cards. This is one that's pretty strong, but we don't have an ace, and we don't have a lot of high potential. So this is one where I kind of like the min raise, because if someone raises back at you, you kind of know where you stand a little bit. You know that some of the aces are dead, and it juices the pot a little bit, so that if an ace flops, then you've got a little bit of a pot to start with, but you're not risking a lot of money before the flop. So something I do every now and then. So when these guys just call, so that it kind of tells you that the aces are probably live, but we don't bing one. And so here's one where we just totally whiffed. We have pair fours and a kind of junky 2-3 low draw. Gutter ball to the straight, but there's two players, and there's all these low draws and flush draws and stuff. So this is another one to really check behind, and good, I finally did it that time, unlike that other hand. So I was beginning to worry about myself there for a minute. All right, from the cutoff, again, not the strongest hand in the world, but we are in the cutoff, and this guy is fairly tight. And I haven't gone back and looked at his position stats and how well he's using position. A lot of these players that are good don't always use their position well enough. A really good player should be calling like a ton of hands and 3-betting me a fair bit from the button, but I don't know if he's actually going to do that too much or not. So we flop. So what do we flop? Open ender and a reasonable low draw heads up against this guy. So we've got a fair amount of equity, pretty decently strong hand. And this is one where a lot of times you're going to end up chopping, and so we bet half. I think that was a little small. I think betting full pot there is probably better, because you don't want him tagging along with some of his crappy flush draws and things like that. And he ends up calling. Alright, so we're going to make this the last hand. And this raise, that's, it's pretty decent. I don't think this guy was, like I said, using his button too much against me, so that's okay to raise from the cutoff. It's a little bit on the speculative side. If I was in the hijack or early position, probably would not want to be raising that too much there. We get two callers. Now we got the nut flush draw with the paired board, and so here's one where you're going to want to bet and get some value if you happen to bing the nut flush, and we've got some other kind of backdoor draws and stuff. And this is a board that really freezes a lot of people. So if somebody calls, you're not going to get called by too many flush draws, because they're not going to be to the nuts, and people are going to be a little bit worried that the board is paired. And so this is one that I'm going to c-bet a lot, and if people play with me, they're generally going to have a 7. They're not going to call you too much with backdoor low draws, and They're not going to have a lot of 8-9 hands in their range, drawing at weird straights and things like that, especially when the board's paired with a flush. So I think if this checks to us and we bet, a lot of times we're going to take it down, and if it doesn't, pretty often we're going to be up against a 7, and that ends up taking it down. So with that, I think I'm going to conclude this video. So hope you guys enjoyed it. And please, if you got any questions or comments for me, you can post in the forum or send me a PM or whatever, and I'll be happy to get back to you. All right, so thanks.